The Pyramids of Giza, the Great Wall of China, the Statue of Liberty, the Grand Canyon. These ancient megastructures have inspired and stimulated our collective imagination for generations. But how are these monuments constructed? It still remains a mystery how many of the world's greatest and most awe-inspiring wonders came to be. Until now, new evidence uncovered by the world's leading historians, archaeologists, and geologists have exposed an ancient race of automobiles resembling the modern-day Ford F-150, a truly classic automobile with timeless design and reliability. This is Ancient Automobile. It's time for Ancient Automobiles. Wow, it's tough watching this. It brings back a lot of dark and disturbing memories for me. In 2015, Skeleton Realm began work on this project, Ancient Automobiles. I was fresh out of university with a degree in history, and I had just received an F grade mark for my thesis on how Ford F-150's built the Egyptian pyramids. I was young, I was naive, and I got in way over my head. I didn't fully realize how much looking into this fascinating fact of history would anger the powers that be, but that quickly became apparent. Shortly after starting this project with my producer Sam, we were both heavily targeted. First by anonymous letters, death threats, and then by overt brazen visits to both our homes by federal agents. One night, Sam even had a sniper fire one round through his window and destroy an ornate vase sitting on a small table exactly 1 inch from his head as he slept. The message was clear. Do not make this documentary, and do not tell the world the truth about the role of Ford F-150s in the construction of the ancient Egyptian pyramids. We had obviously pissed off some big players, and it was clear that if we didn't stop production, we'd pay the ultimate price. Our reputations, lives, perhaps most shockingly, our families' lives were now at risk. So, we stopped. And we decided to move on from the project, never to speak about it again. Until now. Today, I've decided to complete this project and tell this never-before-heard story and perspective about who really built the Egyptian pyramids, and perhaps many other ancient structures. So, before we get into it, I'd like to add a quick disclaimer to the beginning of this video. If my body is found beaten and bloodied in a dirty ditch, or thrown off a large bridge, drowned in a river, dismembered, blown up, incinerated, or otherwise annihilated and destroyed, know the reason why. I am risking my life for this content, and my death will not be an accident. Let's get into it. My part in this story began in 1999. I was a 7-year-old boy in Warner Robins, Georgia, the location of a top-secret U.S. military airfield, which only later I realized was full of ancient secrets. But we'll get to that later. It was June of 1999, and President Bill Clinton had signed a series of military actions with the objective of leading a NATO alliance in a 79-day air war that would expel Serb forces from Kosovo. But we'll get to that later. In one of Clinton's executive orders that month, a small and seemingly inconsequential action was taken by the president. An order was signed to move 10,000 trucks from Warner Robins Air Force Base in Georgia to Homey Airport, or what is more commonly referred to as Area 51. But we'll get to that later. Hidden within the dense verbiage of the order is an allusion to several auxiliary units, which are referred to as Desert Scarabs, an obvious code name for some sort of vehicle or weapon. The end of the document is almost entirely redacted, save for one mention of the Desert Scarabs. What was this all about? We'll get to that now. Fast forward, it was the fall of 1999. My parents were driving my sister and I to our grandparents' home outside Perry, Georgia, just south of Warner Robins Air Force Base, for the weekend. Each year, we would collect ripe southern pecans with my grandfather, who owned a sizable orchard in the area. We would drive through the orchard in my grandfather's 1985 Dodge Ram 250 pickup truck, traveling down each row of trees and picking up buckets full of harvested pecans, filling the bed with the wonderful nuts. Everything was normal this year, except for one detail: the truck. As we pulled into my grandparents' long driveway, we noticed that my grandfather's regular '85 Dodge had been replaced by a 1998 Ford F-150. Parked by the garage, in the driveway, it stood shining brilliantly white in the bright noon sun. But something was off and strange about its appearance. Despite being only 1 year old, the truck looked weathered, as if it had seen a decade or more of heavy use. The back bumper was malformed and bent slightly, and as we got closer, we noticed that it appeared as though the paint job in certain spots had almost been sandblasted. There was nothing that exceptionally unusual about my grandfather getting a new truck that year. The '85 Dodge had been on its last leg, and it was not surprising to us that he had sprung for something newer. The peculiarity of the truck's weathered appearance was also something not dwelt on very long by anyone. We simply chalked it up to the truck having been used rigorously in the short year period before my grandfather purchased it. After all, he did buy the truck used, and at a government auction, he told us. Vehicles purchased this way are often part of a fleet of decommissioned government vehicles that have not been used lightly, to say the least. It wasn't until about half an hour into harvesting the sweet southern pecan nuts that I noticed something I would never forget. The truck bed was full, but there were 2 buckets left to collect. My grandfather directed me to place the buckets at the feet of the front passenger seat. I did as instructed, but in the process, spilled some nuts on the floor. We drove the nuts back to the garage and parked the truck. Upon unloading the 2 buckets in the cab, I crawled up and under the glove compartment to gather the handful of nuts which spilled into that area. As I dove into this cramped spot, something caught my eye. Underneath the glove compartment was a perfect engraving of a scarab, a beautiful and ornate Egyptian hieroglyph depicting the Desert Beetle. I reached up and touched the engraving to find that the area underneath the glove box was not plastic or metal, but stone. The sight would have been something novel and strange for anyone, let alone a 7-year-old. I ran to my parents and told them about the engraving. Eventually, one by one, the adults knelt down and looked up at the image, noticing the stone surface underneath the dash as well. Everyone was intrigued, but eventually attributed the engraving to some symbol the government must have added in order to designate the vehicle for some purpose or other. I could tell at the time that my grandfather was especially disturbed by the engraving. When he first saw it, his face went pale, and he muttered something under his breath which I'll never forget. "It's real," he said as he smiled slightly, then shot quickly back into fear. It seemed like his inquisitive mind needed to understand everything it could about the engraving. Over the weekend, he repeatedly revisited the truck in the garage, sometimes in the middle of the night, shining a flashlight up at the hieroglyph. He took photos and sketched the symbol, mostly in secret when he thought everyone in the house was asleep. Little did he know, I was watching and paying attention. A few months later, while we were back visiting my grandparents one weekend, I heard my grandfather making a private phone call in the other room. I leaned into the door and listened in. He had called the local government representative for the auction house, which facilitated the sale of the truck. He explained the engraving to the man on the phone, and after a moment, the conversation abruptly ended. My grandfather had a sour look on his face as he hung up the phone. I watched through a crack in the door as he stood up and walked to his closet, then opened a large safe which was about 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide. Inside, it looked like there was a large stone of some sort. I quickly darted away as he shut the safe and started towards the door. Several days later, something happened and we still don't know what. The next time we visited my grandparents, the truck was gone. And when we asked what happened to it, they avoided the question and changed the subject. They didn't want to talk about it. This began a series of strange and unfortunate events for my family for the next several decades, which continue to this day. My grandparents' orchard suddenly succumbed to pecan weevils, and their crop so drastically diminished that they were forced to sell the land and their home on it. Shortly after selling the property to a faceless landholding company in the region, it was entirely burnt to the ground, according to local news, struck by lightning, though no witnesses were present to confirm this. My family relocated to Savannah, Georgia, and for the next few years, my grandparents' new home was broken into several times. Strangely, only my grandfather's cameras and film were stolen. It was formulaic. The crooks would enter their home, leaving everything untouched except for family photo albums and cameras, which they would tear through and leave strewn out on the floor. Both my grandparents passed away within a decade after selling the orchard, and during that time would never speak of the Desert Scarab or that '98 Ford truck. The truck was never to be spoken of in my family, and my grandparents did not mention the incident for the rest of their lives. The topic was simply off limits for us. During this time, my father and mother also received strange letters, threatening our entire family's lives if we ever talked about the truck. My father was even visited at work by a group of strange men who threatened him in some way or other in regards to talking about what he had seen in the truck in '99. The details of which he took to the grave, as he only confided the fact that he was visited by the men on his deathbed over 15 years later. So then, that brings us to today. What was inside that truck? Where did the truck come from? Who put the hieroglyph there? Was it even a hieroglyph? Who was so hell-bent on my family not talking about the truck, and why? Back to that 1999 presidential order. What was the Desert Scarab mentioned in the documents? In 2005, an official story came out of the Pentagon that the Desert Scarab was code for a fleet of military vehicles built specifically for the Gulf War and used during the invasion of Kuwait. The line from the Pentagon was immediately met with confusion. Not a single military personnel of any rank who served at that time could confirm the use of this term in reference to any American vehicle used during the operation. Not only that, but the first appearance of the term was clearly in the 1999 presidential order, appearing well after the Gulf War ended. What's even stranger is that when pressed on the issue, the Pentagon quickly retracted their original statement on the Desert Scarab term found in the FOIA documents. Any mention of it was scrubbed from the record. Why? The year was 3600 BC, and disparate Neolithic groups along the Nile River were beginning to form a cohesive civilization. Use of copper and the production of more advanced clay pottery common to the wider area of the southern Levant point to a clear shift in this period towards a more complex society. During this time, there was a distinct divide between what is known as Upper and Lower Egypt. The two regions warred frequently. During the reign of King Narmer, the unification of Lower and Upper Egypt occurred, and what followed was a long period of unified Egyptian culture and civilization. King Narmer can be seen in depictions during this time as wearing a double crown, composed of the lotus flower, a representation of Upper Egypt, and the papyrus, representing Lower Egypt. These are all unquestioned historical facts, and depictions of Narmer can be clearly seen on numerous stone artifacts. However, one incredible stone of the era depicted Narmer in a much more peculiar scenario, standing in the bed of what appears to be a Ford F-150 truck. I know what you're thinking. Okay, show us the stone. That's incredible. I will, but we'll get to that later. Fast forward over 4,500 years, and a group of 11th century Flemish noblemen were setting a course for the Holy Land in 1043. The group was funded by Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, who himself did not accompany the men on their journey. Legend has it that Baldwin accidentally funded the journey after being so inebriated during the holiday season, he agreed to every proposition made towards him for a week-long period during Christmas.
Yes.
The exposition was to be a pilgrimage to the Holy Land with a long detour into Egypt, led by Charles the Wide, a nobleman from Bruges. Expeditions into the Holy Land without any ulterior military objective were somewhat common in the era, and it was to be a religious trip for the noblemen, who probably also planned to bring back any relics or treasures they found along the way. Charles the Wide was a wealthy man from Bruges who is said to have had a particularly wide, large appearance. He was not tall, but extremely wide and possessed a dense barrel-chested frame. Despite being about 4 feet tall in stature, Charles weighed nearly 300 pounds and required a special horse bred for extreme strength called a muscle bred to carry him the some 10,000 kilometer round-trip journey to Jerusalem and back. Charles kept a diary of the entire journey, but much of his account is extremely bland and boring. Nearly every day's entry merely reports what Charles ate for breakfast and the details of his bowel movement for that day, its consistency, size, and smell. Very rarely during the nearly year-long journey did Charles include something of note in the diary. The day the group reached the pyramids of Giza was one such day in which we find something interesting in the record. Charles woke that morning early after having camped just outside the pyramids and entered into his diary this, translated into English.
Morning, day 269. I rose to consume berries and small green sticks, which we found growing within a small desert oasis 3 days past. Bowel movement was wet. Consistency similar to porridge. Smelled of roses and fennel seed. Late last night, when arriving at the Great Pyramids, we encountered a strange object. 2 large wheels connected by a long stick, halfway buried in the desert sand. It appears unnatural and constructed with extreme precision. Charles the Wide, Diary, 11th century.
Several days later, Charles made his next entry.
Night, day 273. Consumed desert flowers and camel's flank spiced with hot sands. Bowel movement was thick, rigid and hard, very long. Smelt of a dry creek bed and cinnamon flowers. Since 3 days past, we have discovered much about the strange object and located an underground temple nearby, donned with the image of the unified king, wearing the double crown and riding in a strange horseless carriage. The temple entrance is adorned in rich imagery of the Desert Beetle. It is full of horseless carriages, constructed with hard metals. We have discovered the process by which the carriages are activated and move on their own, without the need of a horse. We have decided to gather the carriages and transport them back to Flanders. Charles the Wide, Diary, 11th century.
Along with this entry, Charles provided a sketch of the carriages which shockingly resemble a modern-day Ford F-150. The final entry into Charles' diary, kept during the pilgrimage, comes to us several months later. The group had reached the Balkans and were now well on their way back to Flanders, still in possession of the driverless carriages.
Morning, day 308. Consumed monk's head and roasted horse. Bowel movement was loose and slipped out like water. Purely liquefied and no hardened substance whatsoever. Smelt of Eastern perfumes and sugar. Our carriages have ceased their movement. Much maneuvering of the complex pipes and tubes have yielded no results. We have placed the carriages in the possession of a local lord to return and retrieve them at a later date. Charles the Wide, Diary, 11th century.
This was to be Charles's last entry, and it's the final clue we have as to what happened to the pilgrimage party and their newfound horseless carriages. The group never returned to Flanders, and over the following centuries, several search parties swept through the region of what is now modern-day Serbia and Kosovo, trying to locate evidence of what happened to the lost lords. Charles's diary was found nearly 100 years later by one of these search parties, along with all of the lord's clothing, neatly folded up and placed in a large stone container inside a cave near modern-day Pristina in Kosovo. But nothing else. Locals claim to have never seen the men, and there was never any luck in locating them. So, the question remains, what is the Desert Scarab referred to in the 1999 FOIA documents? Charles mentions that the temple in which these strange horseless carriages were found contained images of the Desert Beetle etched on its entrance. Coincidence? And where is this temple today? Has any record of it in Egypt been found? We'll get to that now. Nearly 800 years after Charles and the Flemish pilgrims made their journey through Giza, Napoleon's army marched on Egypt and swiftly brought the region under their control. An often overlooked and seemingly small detail of one battle comes to us from the personal account of one of Napoleon's infantrymen, Louis Dubois, a 19-year-old from Paris, who kept a detailed account of his experiences during Napoleon's Syrian and Egyptian campaigns. One of Dubois' diary entries was written immediately after his participation in the Battle of the Pyramids, a major engagement fought on the 21st of July, 1798, which saw a decisive French victory over the Mamluks. Dubois entered this into his diary that day.
The battle ended in our great victory. During one great push forward, General Bond directed us toward a small ravine near to the river, in which the opening to a large cavernous underground temple structure lay. The exposed area of the structure was covered in images of the Desert Scarab Beetle. Several hundred Mamluks scurried into the temple, and upon the general instruction, we trapped the men inside. We proceeded to pack hundreds of barrels full of gunpowder strategically around the exposed section of the structure, ignited them, and completely destroyed it. all men inside perished and the structure was completely annihilated. I did find one singular stone which survived the blast. It depicts an ancient king riding in some sort of horseless carriage. I have kept it for safekeeping.
Could it be that this temple is the same structure Charles made reference to in the 11th century, adorned with images of the Desert Scarab Beetle? Was this stone depicting an ancient king donning the double crown referred to by both Dubois and Charles, King Narmer riding in a Ford F-150? We'll get to that later. Let's take a step back and return to Kosovo. The NATO air raid on the region was quick. The year before, in 1998, President Clinton had declared a national state of emergency, officially due to, quote, unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States, imposed by Yugoslavia and Serbia over the Kosovo War.
Do our interest in Kosovo justify the dangers to our armed forces? I've thought long and hard about that question. I am convinced that the dangers of acting are far outweighed by the dangers of not acting, dangers to defenseless people and to our national interests.
Internal sources at the CIA and State Department point to another reason for the intervention entirely, however. I spoke with an individual who I cannot and will not name due to their and my own safety. What I can say is that I met this individual shortly after production began on ancient automobiles in 2015, and he sought me out after he claimed that he had left the CIA and heard rumblings of our project through the halls of the State Department and the Pentagon. The individual claimed to have been a CIA operative working in Eastern Europe during the 80s and 90s, who I met at a McDonald's outside Richmond, Virginia in 2016. I recorded our conversation, and he had this to say about Clinton and NATO's decision to get involved in the Kosovo War.
So basically, NATO involvement wasn't about regional or national security interests at all. It was about the Scarab mostly. The conflict was really just a cover-up. It just lined up perfectly.
So, the Scarab.
Yeah, the trucks.
Can you flesh that out further?
Yeah, well, so the conflict really was not important until the department got intel of the trucks being found. The F-150's from Egypt, the ones that built the pyramids, The trucks had been found in Kosovo with, the conflict going on. And Clinton and NATO decided to take the opportunity to airlift the trucks out.
So, the trucks built the pyramids?
Yeah, look, I really don't know. It sounds crazy, but yeah, I think they did.
Needless to say, I was shocked after this interview. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and I couldn't be totally sure if what I heard from this man who claimed to be affiliated with the CIA was true. I'd put the pieces together over the years enough to make the inference that trucks built the pyramids, but here is what seemed like definitive proof. Was this guy a deranged lunatic, or perhaps even sent by the elites to throw me off? Part of a disinfo campaign against my findings? I needed answers, and I didn't know where else to turn besides my grandfather's old pecan orchard, burned to the ground so many years ago. It seemed like a long shot, but I decided to visit the property and search for any possible clues, drawings or notes left behind by my grandfather. Something, anything that would give me more answers. I suddenly remembered the safe in my grandfather's closet and the strange stone he had retrieved from it. I needed to know more, and I needed closure, so I got in the car and headed to Perry, Georgia. When I got to the property entrance, I noticed that many of the large pecan trees had been burned to the ground. The area around the trees had become overgrown, and I had to walk through thick brush to get to the side of the house which once stood, now a blackened foundation with scraps and trash strewn about. No one had touched the property in 20 years. Being on the property was an emotional experience. I dug through the rubble, finding odds and ends, silverware, half-burned couch cushions, and fragments of walls. Eventually, I made my way to the back corner of the house where my grandparents' bedroom had once been, and into the area that was the closet. I was dumbfounded. There it was, my grandfather's safe, apparently fireproof and appearing totally untouched. I shook the safe slightly and felt a heavy object inside move back and forth. It had to be the stone. To my amazement, I was able to crack the code within several tries. The code was simply my grandfather's birthday. I couldn't believe my luck. As I slowly pulled open the door, I just about fainted. Staring straight at me was a stone about 3 by 2 feet propped up inside the safe. And there it was, the image of King Narmer with his double crown, standing in the bed of a Ford F-150 pickup truck. I frantically clinged to the stone and pulled it out of the safe, then lugged it back to the car and got off the property as quickly as I could. When I returned home to Atlanta, I brought the stone into my living room and examined it closely. It seemed real. There it was, King Narmer. I couldn't believe it. But now there were more questions. If this was the stone mentioned by Charles the Wide and Dubois, how did it end up in South Georgia over 200 years later? I started thinking about my family history. My grandfather's parents had immigrated from Western Germany to the US in the 1890s. Could they have brought it over? I quickly visited Ancestry.com to see if there were any clues. Ancestry.com is an awesome service and the sponsor of today's video. Ancestry helps you understand your genealogy. A family tree takes you back generations. The world's largest collection of online family history records makes it possible. Save up to 30% on Ancestry gift membership. Give your loved ones a meaningful way to connect with family this season. No shipping required, so it'll get there on time. Use promo code SkellyFordF150 at checkout for a further 5% off. So I logged into Ancestry.com and tracked back my family lineage, and there it was. My great-great-great-grandmother, Simone Dubois, born 1804, daughter of Louis Dubois. I was shocked. The stone had somehow made its way through my family lineage to my grandfather, and now to me. It all seemed like too much. We had just had to cease production on ancient automobiles, and now this? Did my grandfather know about the truck he was buying and where it was from? Was it a coincidence that our family heirloom was in such direct connection to the truck? Was the truck purchased and orchestrated smear at my grandfather, meant to drive him mad? In many ways, I was more confused than ever. And well, I still am. It's been 7 long years since I found the stone and we stopped production. And in that time, I've done enough research to fill probably 10 documentaries. So at some point, I need to stop. You might be wondering now why I'm willing to go public about this information. And I really don't have a good answer for that. I guess it's because I feel like I've got nothing else to lose. It's been a tough ride. The elites have basically taken everything from me, due to even just starting our documentary in 2015. So now I know for sure that I will probably be killed, but it's a great relief to tell my story. I also feel a deep need to share this stone with the world and show proof of this hidden history. The pyramids were built by trucks, and it's blatantly obvious. No matter what government operatives say, there are dozens of forbidden and hidden F-150s deep within Area 51 as we speak, and if the public could see, that might change everything. I'd like to end on this. No matter what happens to me, know that Ford F-150 trucks built the Egyptian pyramids. If you get nothing else from this project, just know that. And with that, I bid you adieu, friends, and I'll see you on the other side.